Okay, y'all, we are going to dive into module 3, and we're talking about two very interesting approaches: object relations couples therapy and mentalization based couples therapy. So, what is object relation couples therapy, or ORCT? So, many years ago, when I first got in this field, actually, when I was still in graduate school, I remember um, hearing about object relations therapy. We didn't talk about it much at school, but I remember hearing about it. And I was intrigued, but also so confused. It just seems so elusive and abstract to me. I mean, over the years, I've come to understand it a little better, but do I use it in its pure form? No. But as we talked about in week one, um, the integrative approach, I do take an integrative approach that takes a little bit of bits and pieces from each therapy, from each theory, even object relations. So, object relation couples therapy is grounded in psychoanalytic theory. Remember Freudian's theory? Um, Particularly, object relations theory views intimate relations as arenas where early attachment experiences and internalized objects are reenacted. When we talk about internalized objects, they're mental representations of caregivers. So, again, think about that. So, ORCT, which is Object Relations Couples Therapy, views intimate relationships as arenas or platforms where early attachment experiences and internalized objects or mental representations of our caregivers are reenacted in this romantic relationship. Uh, so, what are the core assumptions of ORCT? Well, the core assumption is basically that partners unconsciously project unmet childhood needs and unresolved conflicts onto one another. So, the therapist's role is to help each partner become aware of these projections and develop more mature ways of relating. So, this is really important because I do see this. I see this in with couples that I work with quite often. Think about it in your own life and in your own relationships. So, what are the key concepts in ORCT? So, internal objects. That's one of the key concepts. Internal objects are early caregiver images that shape how one perceives and relates to others. So again, think of that as somebody that had a very domineering, powerful kind of father who really didn't have a relationship with his children but kind of ruled with an iron fist and was easily disappointed. So that person carries that image of their caregiver into their relationship with their husband. um, so another key concept is projection and projective identification. So, partners attribute unwanted parts of the self to each other, often leading to cyclical conflict. So, think about that. What does that mean? Partners attributed unwanted parts of themselves to each other. So, the things they don't like in themselves, they will attribute it to the other person. It's a little bit alike when we hear about projection as a defense mechanism, one of the Freudian defense mechanisms, projection. Also, another important key concept in ORCT is transference. And y'all have probably heard of transference and countertransference in therapy. So both partners and the therapist experience emotional responses based on past relationships because there's that transference and countertransference going on. If you have a couple and you have this, you have this man, this the in the couple, and he is just antagonistic or whatever he is, but he reminds you of, say, your father. You're going to have those countertransference issues in the therapy session. So you have to make sure that you're working through them. So it's just not the client that is going to experience transference, countertransference, but it's also the counselor. So we have to be aware of that in our session. So what is the goal of ORCT? Well, basically, is to promote insight, emotional differentiation, and mutual empathy by uncovering these unconscious dynamics. Okay, so the focus, the therapeutic focus in this approach is to explore the unconscious meaning behind conflict. And again, going back to those terms that we talked about, the unconscious meaning behind conflict a lot of times is based on the projection and the internal objects. We also want to identify and interpret those projections. We want to foster awareness of how past relational wounds shape current patterns. We've seen that happen time and time again. We want to strengthen each partner's capacity for emotional attunement and individuation. So individuation, remember what that is. It is really about being an individual and having your own thoughts, your own feelings, and your own opinions. So mentalization-based couples therapy, this isn't one that we hear about too often. So you don't see it practiced a lot in couples therapy, but it's an attachment-based model that focuses on the capacity to mentalize, which is basically to understand one's own and one's partner's thoughts, feelings, and intentions. I mean, it seems pretty basic, just being able to it's almost like having that empathy and being able to create this mental image of your partner's and your own feelings and thoughts and intentions. So the basic assumption in this approach is that relationship distress arises when partners lose their ability to mentalize under stress. So misunderstandings, emotional reactivity, and conflict escalate when each person interprets the other's behavior without curiosity or empathy. So again, when we think about mentalize, it's we can replace that with empathize. When we're stressed, when we're in a high conflict situation, we're not thinking about, this other person, where's this other person coming from? How are they feeling? No, we're thinking about fighting this battle. We go into this fight or flight mode, and we're not thinking about the other person's feelings. We don't mentalize. So some of the key concepts in this approach are obviously what we just talked about, mentalization. And that's the ability to see behavior as driven by internal mental states. So in other words, we see behavior as more than just behavior. We see it rooted as something going on within the person, that person's mental state, their experiences, their feelings, their thoughts, their emotions. Another key concept is non-mentalizing modes. This is kind of like the psychic equivalence of it's assuming so it's like when we assume one's perception is reality, we kind of see them from a teleological mode, judging only by actions. In other words, again, we're not looking at the mentalization aspect. We're non-mentalizing. We're not having that empathy. We're just seeing the behaviors and the actions and not really seeing the root of them. So the goal in this type of therapy is to restore that reflective functioning. So it's the ability to stay curious about what's happening inside oneself and inside one's partner, especially during conflict. And as you know, if you've had conflict, that's not always easy to do. I'm not thinking about what the other person's feelings or thoughts, or how, his or her behaviors are being motivated by those feelings or thoughts. So, yeah, so there's just it's a very interesting approach. The therapeutic focus in mentalization-based couples therapy is to improve emotion regulation and reflective dialogue between partners, to use here and now exploration of interactions, and to emphasize curiosity. The therapist models mentalizing by demonstrating empathy, transparency, and humility. So here's a little chart that will help you understand the similarities between ORCT and MBCT. So I'm not going to go over all these. Obviously, you can see them right there. But just remember, there are some similarities and there are also some differences, which you will see on the next slide. The differences between ORCT and MBCT. So just file these away. I've tried to make these very kind of clear and handy for you to have in the future as we continue to discuss the different therapeutic approaches in couples therapy.